Welcome to our deep dive into the world of investigations and ethics.
Yeah.
You sent over a really fascinating mix of sources for this one. We've got court cases, cybersecurity standards, even a few historical pieces. Our mission, to help you understand how these investigations actually work, the rules of evidence, and all the ethical codes that kind of keep everything on the straight and narrow, you know?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, I think, how this is relevant to, well, everyone.
Right.
Whether you're into tech or a true crime fan or just someone who wants to know, like, how things really work behind the scenes.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start with the different types of investigations.
Okay.
Your sources mentioned four main categories: administrative, criminal, civil, and regulatory. The best way to understand these is through like real-world examples, right?
Absolutely. Think of a big company, say, like a social media platform. If their server suddenly crashed and they need to figure out why, that's an example of an operational administrative investigation.
Yeah.
They're looking internally to solve a problem and make sure things run smoothly.
Got it. So it's all about finding the root cause and fixing it, right?
Right.
But what about those employee scandals you sometimes hear about? Like, say, someone using company funds for something personal.
That would most likely trigger a non-operational administrative investigation.
Yeah.
The company would investigate the employee, and that could lead to, well, disciplinary action and the evidence they need. It really varies. Sometimes it's super clear. Other times it's way more circumstantial.
Interesting. So it's like a company's internal justice system.
Yeah.
Okay, now for something with higher stakes criminal investigations, think like classic detective work, a murder mystery or bank robbery or even a cybercrime ring.
Exactly. And in criminal cases, it's all about proving guilt.
Okay.
Beyond a reasonable doubt, which is like a really high standard. Investigators have to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and put together a case that'll hold up in court.
Right, a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
Now, how about civil investigations? Those are more about, disagreements between people or companies, right?
Yes.
Like that lawsuit where that coffee company got sued for having, like, dangerously hot coffee.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah.
So in civil cases, you don't need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It's more about the preponderance of the evidence.
Yeah.
Whoever has slightly stronger evidence wins.
Hmm.
Kind of like, those old-fashioned scales of justice.
Okay.
The side that tips the scales even a little bit wins.
Interesting. So civil cases, the scales don't need to tip all the way, just a tiny bit can make a difference. Okay, now, the big guns, regulatory investigations. This is where government agencies get involved, right?
Exactly. Think organizations like the SEC, EPA, FTC. They investigate companies or individuals that might have broken regulations. Things like environmental protection, or financial reporting, or consumer safety. And these investigations, they can have a huge impact. Often they lead to fines, sanctions, even criminal charges.
So it's all about keeping companies and people in check and protecting, well, the public interest.
Exactly.
Now, here's where it gets interesting. What about those situations that aren't like legal investigations, but still have serious consequences?
Right.
Things like data breaches or specific industry rules.
That's where things like industry standards and best practices come in.
Okay.
A great example is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard,
Okay.
PCI DSS for short.
Got it.
It's not, a law, but companies that deal with credit card info are expected to follow it to protect sensitive data. That way they can avoid, like, huge fines.
So it's like follow these rules or else.
Exactly. It levels the playing field, and it encourages companies to make security a priority, even if it's not, like, legally required.
That makes sense. Okay, we've talked about types of investigations, but what about the evidence itself, especially now, where so much of our lives is online? How do investigators even handle evidence when it's not a physical object, but like a mountain of emails, texts, digital files?
You're talking about e-discovery.
Yeah.
It's all about managing electronic information for legal stuff.
Yeah.
And it can get a lot more complex than you might think.
For sure. One of your sources mentioned something called the EDRM, the Electronic Discovery Reference Model. That sounds pretty intense.
It can be. It's a 9-step process, but there's a mnemonic to help remember it. I prefer collecting precious rubies and precious pearls.
Okay, I love mnemonics. Break that down for us.
So each word stands for a different stage. It starts with information governance, which is like organizing and managing data so it's ready if e-discovery is needed. Then there's identification, where you figure out the specific info that might be relevant. And preservation is key too, so making sure nothing is tampered with or deleted.
Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want crucial evidence just disappearing.
Right. Then comes collection, getting all that data in one spot. Processing helps get rid of the irrelevant stuff. And then review is where lawyers dig deep to find the really important bits and make sure that nothing confidential is accidentally shared.
Oh, wow. So it's like finding a needle in a digital haystack.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah.
Then we've got analysis where, they really look at the content and meaning of the remaining info. Production involves prepping the evidence, like using specific formats to share it with other parties involved. And finally, presentation, which is all about how the evidence is shown and used, in court.
Wow, that's a lot more intricate than I imagined. It really shows how digital evidence has changed the game for investigations.
Oh, for sure. It's a whole new world.
Right.
The legal systems had to change a lot to keep up.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's talk about what happens when the evidence, actually makes it to the courtroom. What are the rules about what is and isn't admissible?
There are 3 key requirements: relevance, materiality, and competence. The evidence has to be relevant to the case, obviously,
Right.
connected to the specific issue, and it has to be obtained legally.
So no sneaking in evidence from an illegal search?
Exactly. That would be inadmissible.
Okay.
Courts have very strict rules to ensure, fairness and to protect everyone's rights.
Makes sense. Got it. Okay, let's break down the different types of evidence.
Oh.
First, we have real evidence, right?
Right.
This is all about tangible things.
Right.
Weapons, fingerprints, DNA.
Like, physical clues from a crime scene.
Yeah.
Real evidence is really powerful, especially DNA evidence. It's been huge for forensic science, and it's helped solve so many crimes.
It's like having a microscopic witness.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
Then we have documentary evidence, which includes all sorts of written stuff: contracts, emails, texts, even social media posts. It's like the paper trail, but nowadays it's usually digital.
It's crazy how much of our communication is actually documented.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And there are a few interesting legal things with documentary evidence. The best evidence rule, for example, usually means the original document is what's preferred in court, not a copy. And then the parole evidence rule says written agreements usually override any conflicting verbal agreements.
So get everything in writing. Good advice for life in general.
For sure. Okay, now let's talk about testimonial evidence.
Okay.
This is all about witness statements, like what people saw or heard or went through. It can be given in court or in written depositions.
The I was there, I saw it, here's what happened kind of evidence.
Exactly. And a witness's statement, under oath, that can be really impactful in a case.
And finally, we've got demonstrative evidence. This one's trickier, right?
Yeah, a bit.
It might not be admitted as evidence itself, but it helps a jury understand complex stuff, right?
Exactly. Think things like charts or diagrams, 3D models, even animations. They're visual tools that can clarify tough concepts or even recreate a scene.
Got it. So it's like visual storytelling, but for a courtroom.
Exactly.
Yeah, it makes abstract stuff more concrete. Okay, so we've covered real evidence, documentary, testimonial, and demonstrative. But here's the million-dollar question. How do investigators handle digital evidence? I mean, so much of our lives is online emails, social media, online banking. It's a whole landscape.
That's where digital forensics comes in. It's meticulous, it's specialized, and it's guided by super strict principles to, make sure that evidence is handled correctly.
Yeah.
Think of it like detective work for the digital age.
So it's not just about knowing how to use a computer. You need to know how to collect, preserve, and analyze digital evidence so it's actually usable in court.
Precisely. And digital forensic investigators, they use all these sophisticated techniques to get data from computers, smartphones, servers, you name it, even the cloud.
Wow.
They have to be experts in data recovery, file analysis, network forensics, the whole 9 yards.
One of your sources mentioned something called Locard's exchange principle. What's that?
Oh, it's a classic forensic idea that says every contact leaves a trace. Even in the digital world, everything you do leaves a mark, like a file you create or an email you send or a website you visit. And these digital forensic investigators, they know how to uncover those traces and put the pieces together.
That's fascinating and a little unnerving, honestly. It makes you realize we need to be careful about our digital footprint.
Exactly. And it shows how important digital forensics is now in modern investigations.
Okay, let's go through the actual investigation process. Where do you even start when you're dealing with a possible crime or security incident?
Well, step one is to put together a skilled team.
Okay.
You need people who understand the organization's policies, you know how to handle evidence properly, and have the right expertise.
So it's like creating a specialized task force. Everyone has their own skills and experience.
Exactly. Then, once the team's ready, the next step is to gather the evidence. And this can involve a lot of different methods depending on, well, the nature of the investigation.
Like what? Do you just show up and start taking people's computers?
No, not quite. There are legal things to think about. Evidence can be obtained in many ways: voluntary surrender, subpoenas, court orders, search warrants, or in what are called exigent circumstances, where there's like a clear and present danger that needs immediate action.
So there's this whole legal dance that has to happen before you can even start looking at the data.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. So investigators have to follow, very specific procedures to make sure any evidence they collect can actually be used in court.
Makes sense. You don't want to mess up the case by not following the rules. So once the evidence is gathered, what's next?
Then the real work starts.
Yeah.
Analyzing the data, talking to witnesses, putting all the pieces together. It takes a lot of patience, close attention to detail, and a deep understanding of the tech involved.
So I imagine it's like detective work, but instead of like dusting for fingerprints, you're sorting through computer code, right?
Pretty much.
And speaking of, how do interviews work in investigations?
Well, there's a difference between an interview and an interrogation. An interview is more like a conversation aimed at getting info from someone who might have seen something or just has some relevant knowledge.
Right. Okay.
But an interrogation, well, that's usually for suspects. It involves much more direct questioning and even techniques, to maybe get a confession or find incriminating info.
So the stakes are way higher in an interrogation, and there are more like specific rules.
Absolutely.
Got it.
Suspects have certain rights, obviously.
Right.
Like the right to stay silent, the right to a lawyer. Investigators have to be very careful not to, violate those rights.
Okay, so we've talked about different types of investigations, evidence rules, and the process itself. But what about the ethical part of all this? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of room for, doing things the wrong way, especially when it comes to digital stuff. It's so easy to access and change information these days.
You're right. Ethical considerations are super important, especially with all the digital advancements. Investigators have to be, act with integrity, be objective, and obviously respect the law. They need to think about privacy concerns, avoid conflicts of interest, and just make sure everything they do is well above board.
So it's not just about catching the bad guys, it's about doing it the right way.
Exactly.
Got it.
The ends don't justify the means.
Okay, let's talk about some of the actual codes of ethics that, investigators have to follow.
Right.
Your sources mention a bunch, from government regulations to industry-specific guidelines.
And it's fascinating to see how these codes have, evolved, to keep up with technology.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the most well-known is the U.S. Government Code of Ethics. What are some of the, main points in there?
Well, it's pretty comprehensive. It covers how government employees should conduct themselves.
Yeah.
It covers principles like loyalty to the Constitution, upholding the law, avoiding conflicts of interest, making sure people aren't, using public office for personal gain, and staying impartial.
So it's like the ethical foundation for anyone who works for the government.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about avoiding illegal stuff. It's about holding yourself to a higher standard of behavior so the public can, trust the government.
Now, what about ethical codes specifically for cybersecurity folks? One of your sources mentioned the ISC2 Code of Professional Ethics. What's in that one?
That one's specifically for cybersecurity professionals, right. Developed by the International Information System Security Certification Consortium.
Okay.
ISC2, they call it. It basically lays out 4 main things that guide ethical behavior. Protect society, the common good, public trust and confidence in infrastructure, act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibly, and legally, provide diligent and competent service, and advance and protect the profession.
So it's kind of like a digital version of the Hippocratic Oath, right? A promise to use their skills for good and to protect everyone.
Exactly. Cybersecurity pros have access to a lot of sensitive info and systems, so it's super important that they, follow the highest ethical standards.
And it's pretty amazing to think that even back in 1989, like the early days of the internet, people were already thinking about the need for ethical guidelines.
I know, right?
Yeah.
One of your sources actually mentions RFC 1087, Ethics and the Internet.
Yeah.
It lays out some pretty timeless principles for good behavior online. It encourages folks to avoid, things like unauthorized access, disrupting services, wasting resources, destroying data, and compromising someone's privacy.
It's a good reminder that even though technology has changed so much, like a lot, the main ethical ideas stay the same.
Absolutely. And those principles are more important than ever, especially now that we're all so interconnected. What we do online can really affect a lot of people.
Okay, one last code to talk about, and this one's a little more fun. The 10 Commandments of computer ethics.
Oh, yeah. It sounds like biblical.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But they're actually just some guidelines made back in the 90s to promote, ethical computer use. They're easy to understand and pretty straightforward, but they address important things like unauthorized access, data privacy, intellectual property, and just being responsible with tech.
So it's like a user-friendly guide to behaving ethically online.
Exactly. And they might seem a little basic, but there's still good advice for figuring out all the ethical complexities of our digital lives.
Okay, we've talked about a lot in this deep dive already.
We have. Thanks for diving deep with us. We hope you found this exploration of investigations and ethics, both informative and empowering. Until next time.